Hi guys, I hope you're doing well, and in this video we're going to be discussing the October-November 2021 paper 12, the MCQ paper for AS. So let's get started. Okay guys, so before I move on with the first question, there is something that I need to tell you, that a lot of students start attempting the MCQ papers in order. That is, they'll first do the question 1, then question 2, then question 3. So this is not the right way to attempt an MCQ paper. The best way, or a more, you could say, a rational way, or something that will help you score marks and increase your confidence, is that first you attempt those questions that are very easy. So if I just go through the paper, so first thing I would need to do is go through the paper, right? So if I look at this, if I look, so on each page there will be approximately 3 to 4 MCQs. So on this page we have 3 MCQs. So look at question 2 and question 3 are the most easiest. Just by looking at the glance of it, you'll understand that these are the questions that I need to attempt first. So you attempt question 2, question 3 first, then you attempt, look at, because on the glance of it, question 4, question 5 seems also very easy. Then you go through question number, let's say, question number, maybe you attempt question 12, and then question number, let's say, 15 and 16, and then let's say question number 19, then question number 2021 also seems very easy, right? So in this way, question 24 seems very easy as well. So in this way, what's happening is that by the end of the paper, like by the end of the point where you reach, where you have glanced all 30 MCQs and you've identified those MCQs that you need to attempt first, you will be easily be able to done. You will be easily be done by 10. You'll be easily, like 10 to 12 MCQs. You'll be through it. So the first 10 to 12 MCQs, you will just nail them, and then you will score 10 to 12. You'll make sure that you get 10 to 12 marks, at least 10 to 12 marks. You'll secure those 10 to 12 marks in the first 10 to 12 minutes, right? Which also means, and this will also boost your confidence, because you'll be like, okay, fine, you know what, I've secured 10 to 12 marks, which means even if you score 10 marks, you are done with 1/3 of the paper, right? So what I'm trying to say to you is that increasing your confidence is very important in the MCQ paper. When the higher the confidence, the better your mind will work, the better your brain will work, and the more quicker you'll be able to understand and comprehend MCQs. So the first step to attempt an MCQ paper is to boost your confidence level. You can only do that by attempting the most easiest MCQs first, and you're like, I'm through. Guys, please remember that in every MCQ paper you will have 10 very easy, very simple MCQs, which means that 1/3 of the paper will always be very easy, which means that 10 MCQs will be very easy. Out of 10, 3, 4 will usually be repeated, right? So there is a trick to attempting the paper, and if you score if you are able to score 1/3 of the paper right in the first 10 minutes, your confidence level will be very high. You will be operating on some another level, and with this better confidence, you will be able to attempt the medium MCQs and then the hard ones. So first of all, you need to divide your paper between easy, medium, and hard. So you first attempt the most easy, then the medium, and then the hard words in hard MCQs in the end. Okay. And I'll be sharing more tricks and tips with you as we go on solving these MCQs in the playlist. So question number 1 says, line XX is the production possibility curve of a worker picking peas and beans in 10-hour working day. So it's a 10-hour working day. A worker is picking peas and beans. So on the x-axis you have quantity of beans that are picked per day. On the y-axis you have quantity of peas that are picked per day. So it's a linear straight line which represents a constant opportunity cost production possibility curve. It shows what would cause the workers PPC to shift to the line YY. So basically you have XX over here. This is a PPC, right? And you have beans on the x-axis and peas on the y-axis. And now what's basically happened is that your production possibility curve has shifted outwards basically, but this is not representing a parallel shift to the right. Basically it's shifting like this, right? So this is your new production possibility curve YY. Now this is basically representing that the productive capacity, the productive potential of peas has basically gone up, because you could see that more peas can now be picked up as compared to the number of beans. Now less number of beans are basically picked up, so the productive potential of beans has basically gone down, right? So there's a decline in the picking capacity of beans as compared to a rise in the picking capacity of your peas, right? So the question is asking you what would have possibly made this happen. So basically if you look at answer option, if you look at the first answer option, it says a decrease in working hours to 8 per day and a machine that increases the workers' pea picking productivity. And this is the correct answer. I'll tell you why. It says a decrease in the working hours to 8 per day. Right now, the working hours is how much? Right now, the working hours is 8. Sorry, the working hours is 10. If you're decreasing the working hours to 8, it means that if this is your production possibility curve, that is XX, and this is your peas and this is your beans. So if you reduce the working hours, it means that you are decreasing the quantity of your number of hours that you're working. So your production possibility curve should shift inwards like YY, right? It should shift parallel inwards होना चाहिए, right? But the PPC is not shifting parallel inwards. In fact, it is basically representing a rise in productive capacity of beans as compared, of productive capacity of peas as compared to beans. So basically, if the working hours have if the working hours goes down, basically it should represent a parallel shift inwards. But your PPC will not shift parallel inwards because the reason is that the second part of it says that there has been a machine, we basically a machine that increases the workers' P picking productivity. So the workers who is so we have a machine that has increased the efficiency or the productivity of the workers to pick peas. Now, if that's the case, now the PPC will not shift parallel inwards. In fact, it will shift like this, which will represent that there is a rise in the productive capacity or the pea picking potential of the workers. However, there's a decline in the beans picking potential of the workers. Because why is beans going down? Actually, peas should have also gone down because you are reducing the number of hours, right? So peas should have gone down as well, while the productive capacity of beans should have gone down as well. If that's the case, the PPC would have shifted parallel inwards from XX to YY like this. But the thing is that although we have reduced the working hours for to 8, but still we've got a machine that has increased the capacity or the productivity of the workers to pick more peas, right? So it's offsetting that the fact that even though you're reducing the number of hours, but since you have a machine that increases your productivity to pick basically pick more peas, so it is going to increase the productive capacity of peas while the productive capacity of beans will go down. Okay, so that is why A should be the correct answer. B, C, and D doesn't make sense because it's not fitting in what the question is asking you. A machine that increases the workers' P picking productivity only, no, because if this was the case, let's say if option B was the case, then your if this was XX and this is P's and this is beans, it says a machine that increases the workers' P picking productivity, right? So basically, your production possibility curve should have pivoted outwards like this. It should have basically, there should have been a rise in the productive capacity, something like this, right? So now this is basically representing a pivotal shift to the right, which is representing that there's no change in the productive capacity of beans while the productive capacity of peas have gone up. So remember that whenever only a factor that can increase or decrease the productive capacity of either one of the good changes, that's basically represents a pivotal shift. Understood? Let's move on to question 2. It says, what is a function of money? Now, such a simple question. This question is a joke. Divisibility, durability, and portability, by the way, are all characteristics of money. They are not functions of money. These are characteristics. So option D, it's a medium of exchange, is the correct answer. You have medium of exchange, store of value, क्या कहते हैं, means of deferred payment. These are all functions of money. Question 3 says, what is classified as a public good by economists? Public goods are those goods that are basically non-excludable and they are non-rivalrous as well. Such as street lights, flood defense. These are all examples of public goods. What do you mean by non-excludable? Non-excludable means that you cannot stop anyone from using it. So if I'm using it, I cannot stop anyone from using it because it's free, right? It's free. Public goods are non-excludable because they are free. Everyone can use it. I can't stop anyone from using it. It's not my good, right? And since it's free, everyone can use it, so it's non-excludable. Secondly, it's non-rivalrous means that, for example, if I'm using it, so the benefit to others will not go down. Right? If I'm using it, the utility I'm getting, exactly the same utility the other person will get. Now let's take an example of a park. Assume there's a park that is close to your house and the entrance is free. So that's also non-excludable. If I enter the park, I cannot stop anyone from entering the park, right? So it's non-excludable. But the park is not non-rivalrous. Why? Because let's suppose if I enter the park and let's suppose 100 more people enter the park, and the park only has a capacity to accommodate 100 people, so 100 people will be able to utilize the benefits, the same benefits, the same utility, but the 101th person will feel that the park is so congested, so he'll not enjoy. Maybe he'll enter the park and leave, right? Because for him now the utility is not the same as for the first 100 people, because this is representing a quasi public good, right? It's not 100% public good, it's a quasi public good that represents some of the characteristic of a private good as well. On the other hand, private goods are those goods that are excludable, which means that if I'm using it, I can stop you from using it because I have paid for it, so it's my good, it's a private good, it's excludable. Secondly, it's rivalrous as well, because if I use it, then I can also if I use it, and the fact that the private good gives me certain benefits, obviously the amount of benefits or the extent of benefits it will give it to me, it won't give it to you. Because let's consider an ice cream. If I eat half of the ice cream, for you only the remaining half is left, right? So, and if I eat all the ice cream, for you nothing is left then, right? So it's rivalrous. The extent of the benefit or the utility that I derive from the public good, then after my consumption, for you it will diminish. That utility for you, available utility for you, will diminish, right? That's what a public good is. So government funded hospitals, even if they are government funded, still hospitals is limited by its physical space, right? There's a certain accommodation available, certain capacity of beds that are available, the rooms that are available, doctors that are available. So obviously it's a quasi public good. Although I cannot exclude you from using that hospital, but still it's rivalrous, it's quasi public. Even government run national parks, although they are not excludable, but they are rivalrous. The internet, it's a private good, because obviously if I pay for it, if you need to pay for the internet in order to use it. Even if you assume that it's free, and let's say it's non-excludable, because let's say the government provides internet free for everyone, so it makes it non-excludable. But then again, the more internet you use, the less the downloading speed for others. So in that sense, yes, it becomes rivalrous. Flood defense, on the other hand, is non-excludable as well as non-rivalrous. So it's a good example of public good. Moving forward, question number 4 says, which statement about factors of production is correct? The part A says the factor capital includes shares and deposit accounts. No, obviously the factor includes human-made resources. The factor labor includes human-made resources. No, human-made resources are your क्या कहते हैं, these are your basically goods, right? So labor is not a good. Human-made resources are those products that are made by people. So it's basically, it simply means your goods that they are talking about. Part C says the factor land includes, yes. So C would be such an easy question. It basically, the land includes all your natural resources. So all natural resources that are not man-made, that have existed before man existed, these are basically they basically come under your factor land. Question 5 says, which supply curve shows that the price elasticity of supply of the good is always equal to 1? Oh, equal to 1 means it's unitary elastic. So yes, PES could also be equal to 1. What is elasticity of supply? It shows the responsiveness of quantity supplied to a change in price. The formula is percentage change in quantity supplied over percentage change in price. Remember that whenever your supply curve starts from the origin, the price elasticity apply at every point on the curve would be equal to 1. So there are two things for a curve that starts from the origin, for the supply curve that starts from the origin. So there are two characteristics. First of all, it has a PES that is equal to 1. Also, that is its unitary elastic. Also, the PES is constant at every point on the supply curve, right? Because for other supply curves, the price elasticity of supply might change as we go above the curve. And we'll see that in the coming videos. There are certain type of questions on this as well. But remember that if the supply curve starts from the origin, it would be unitary elastic, because the PES at any point, on any point where the price or the quantity changes, it would be equal to 1, right? Also, the fact that the elasticity would not vary, it would be constant, it would not change for a supply curve that starts or crosses the origin or starts from the origin and moves upwards from the origin, right? So the answer of 5 should be C, a straight line that passes through the origin. Question number 6 says, what would cause a demand curve to what would cause a shift in the supply curve of good X and a movement along its supply curve? This is another very easy question. So Acha, one more thing, guys. Whenever 2, 3 columns are given now, so it's not important for you to match both the columns while identifying the answer. So, for example, if I look at the first column, what would cause a shift in the supply curve? Obviously, a rise in the wage cost would shift the supply curve, which means that the answer should either be D, or let's say a decrease in factor productivity. This would shift the supply curve. So either the answer could be B or D. So I'll cross out A and C. It's not important for me to, for example, a change in the demand curve for good X will not change the supply curve for good X, right? It's a change in the demand for good X will basically increase the price of good X, and if the price of good X rises, there would be a rise in the quantity supplied of good X. So obviously, because you see, if let's say if this is demand and this is supply, if demand shifts to the right to D2, there would be an upward movement in quantity supplied, right? So it simply means the price would rise, and then price would ration out the excess demand or the shortage. So option A wouldn't be possible. So there's no point in reading what this means. It's just a waste of time. Okay, it's very important for you to attempt the MCQs using certain tricks and tips so that you can manage your time well. Also, part C is not the answer, so there's no point in reading part C, second column of part C as well. Now, why is D the answer? The D should be the answer because it says increase in wage rates. Obviously, it would increase the cost of production. When cost of production goes up, your supply curve would shift to the left or to the right, depending upon in which direction the cost of production is rising. So, and movement along the supply curve, yes, a change in the demand for good X. Just like I told you, that for example, if demand shifts to the right, you guys need to understand that, for example, if this is your demand and this is your supply, and if let's say demand shifts to the right, so there's basically an excess demand, right? Now there's an excess demand in the market, right? Now this is an excess demand in the market. This is representing excess. Now this demand will be rationed out because of the price mechanism. So the prices would keep on rising. They would keep on rising to the point that because when prices will start rising, your quantity demanded would start falling while the quantity supplied would start extending until price would rise until there's a new equilibrium in the market and the market clears itself. It rations out all the excess demand, and this is your new equilibrium E1. But the point is that there's a movement along the supply curve, right? Because a change in demand for good X would obviously result into a movement along the supply curve. So this is the logic behind it, right? So the answer to question 6 should be D. Okay guys, so I hope you're understanding and enjoying this. Question 7 says the market for mobile phones is initially in equilibrium at X, right? So for questions like these now, if you see diagrams and you see so many alphabets, so just take it gradually and slowly. So the first, what I will do is it says equilibrium at X. So I'll look at the diagram. I'll see, okay, this is the demand, this is the supply, and this is the equilibrium position. So I'll first see the demand and the supply, and then I'll see if this is X, this is the original quantity, this is the original price, right? Okay. The government then imposes a sales tax. Sales tax is basically an indirect tax. It's imposed on goods. The effect is increasing cost of production and reducing the supply. What is the government's total tax revenue? So, guys, remember that whenever indirect taxes are imposed, indirect taxes are basically, example is value-added tax and sales tax. These are tax imposed on firms, on the products. The effect of this indirect tax is that it reduces the supply of the product. It shifts inwards because cost of production goes up. Now, guys, remember this thing, that whenever supply shifts inwards, if you want to calculate the value of the tax, remember this, that the vertical distance between these two supply curves, represents the tax per unit. So for example, let's say if this is P1, which is 100, this is P2, which is 130, and let's take this as P3, which is 70, right? This is Q1, let's give them numbers as well. This is 100, and let's say this is 85. So for example, if this is the tax per unit. Now the vertical distance representing tax per unit. So what is the tax per unit? Numerically, the tax per unit would be 130 minus 70, which is how much? 130 minus 70 should be 50. So 60. 60 is basically the tax. $60 is the tax per unit. So right. So how many units are we selling? We are selling 85. So 85 multiplied by 60, because you're selling 85 units, so obviously the revenue generated would be from 85 units that are being sold. 60 times 85 is basically 5100. So 5100 is representing the tax revenue. And what is the area that represents the tax revenue on the diagram? The area is basically this area. This entire area is representing the tax revenue that is collected by the government. The tax, this represents the area basically that the government is receiving as tax revenue. And why is this? I'll tell you a simple reason. Look at this. What is the value of this line, right? This is representing tax per unit, right? Because this should be exactly equal. They both should be equal, right? This value, this line should exactly be equal to this line. So this is basically 60 and this length is 60. What is the breadth? Breadth is 85 because this is 0 to 85. So this would be 85 as well. So 60 times 85. So it's basically, this is representing the area of a rectangle, which is length times breadth. 60 times 85. That's it. That's the simple mechanism that is being applied here. Understood? Which is 60, which is length times breadth, 60 times 85. So numerically, I've shown you graphically, this would be represented by the area that is this area. Like I said, vertical distance between the two supply curve is representing tax per unit. We are selling OQ2 units. So this is the value OQ2. Length times breadth, the area of the rectangle, which is this area. The answer should be TKMR, which is this. So this entire area is representing the total tax revenue. Understood? So C is the answer. Now, guys, at times they're usually asked that of how much is the transferred burden on consumer as well as the producer. So remember that this is representing the tax revenue that is, the tax burden paid by the consumer, and this is representing the tax burden paid by the producer. So this increase in price is basically from 100 to 130. The equilibrium price rises from 100 to 130, which represents there's an increase in price of 30, which means that this 30 is paid by the consumer. How many units are being sold? 85. So if this is 30, this is the breadth is again 85, because this would be the same value. 30 times 85 is how much? Is 2550. 2550 is a tax paid by the consumer, which is represented by the green area. On the other hand, 100 minus, so this below area is representing the tax revenue paid by the producer, this entire box. This should be 100 minus 70, which is 30. 30 times again 85 is representing the tax revenue paid by the producer. 30 times 85, that is again 2550. So basically, and if you add them up, 2550 plus 2550 is 5100, and this should exactly be, this is the tax burden, right? But the burden is for the consumer and producer, but this should be the tax revenue for the government, because for the government it's an income, right? So this should exactly be matched by the tax revenues that the government has received. Now guys, in this scenario, I've just explained you that the burden is shared equally between the consumer and the producer, but it actually depends upon the price elasticity of demand. The more inelastic the demand is, the higher the burden transferred by the producer to the consumer, and the lesser burden will be borne by the producer. Okay guys, so now let's move on. So question 8 says, what is an example of rationing function of price mechanism? Now, what is a price mechanism? We know that price mechanism is a process through which the prices in the free market, they restore equilibrium, they maintain economic efficiency, and they make sure that all the disequilibriums, the shortages, and the surpluses are automatically eliminated without the need of government intervention. And they also ensure that efficient resource allocation takes place in a free market. Basically ensuring that the consumer and producer's welfare is maximized and all of that stuff. So basically, it does that through a process of this basically happens in a price mechanism through the price performing its four main functions, that is a signaling function, incentive, and rationing function. And I've also listed that down. I'll be explaining it to you as well, because I want to take this opportunity for, although the question is asking you only rationing, but I will want to take this opportunity to explain you the four functions so that it may help you later on in the MCQ. So for example, like I said, the price performs four functions. So the first function the price performs is signaling function. So for example, let's say that if demand rises, we know that demand rises at the same price. So if demand would rise, basically it would create a shortage, right? So the producers will see that, there's a shortage in the market, there are long queues taking place, so there's queuing, and the sellers are giving the product to its favorite customers, and a lot of customers are unsatisfied, right? So now obviously this shortage has to be dealt with. So first of all, the prices in the market will start rising automatically, right? And producers will start increasing the prices, because there would be a signal. The reason is that the price would perform a signaling function. So when prices would go up, there would be a signal to the firms to actually expand their output, to extend their quantity supplied in order to meet the higher demand. So that is why that is basically the signaling function of the price, where the price signals the producers to, you know what, hang on, there's a shortage in the market, and now it's time to increase their output in order to, reduce the shortage. At the same time, that same price, when the prices would be rising, they would also be performing a function that is the incentive function, because rising prices would also be an incentive for the firms to actually produce more output to increase their revenues and profits. So the prices are also performing an incentive function for the firms as well. At the same time, guys, the prices are performing a very important function, which is the rationing function, also what the MCQ is asking you. So basically, rationing means that your shortages and surpluses are eliminated. So prices increase, obviously, as prices are rising in the market, it will ration out the shortage and it will restore the equilibrium in the market, and it will restore the economic efficiency in the free market. And how is that? Basically, when prices would rise, it would reduce the quantity demanded and it would increase the quantity supplied. I'll just show you through a way of a diagram. So for example, if this is your demand, this is your supply, and let's say your demand rises in the market, like I said, that remember that whenever demand rises, it always rises at the same price. So your demand would basically go up from Q1 to Q2. Now there's a shortage, right? This distance A minus B is representing a shortage, because this is your, initially this was your demand as well as it was your supply. So now this is your quantity demanded while this is your quantity supplied. So you have a shortage, right? The shortage has to basically be dealt with. And now what will happen is, like I said, the prices would keep on rising. And as the prices would keep on rising, what would happen is it would keep on rising until the new equilibrium price automatically settles at, let's say, the new equilibrium. And basically what would happen is that when prices would keep on rising, like I said, your quantity demand would now contract, since the law of demand works that when price rises, quantity demand falls, and the law of supply tells us that quantity supply would extend. So quantity supplied extends, quantity demanded contracts, and that is how basically the price would ration out the shortage, and it would actually settle at the new equilibrium at Q3. And as we ration out the shortage, we see that there's a new equilibrium where this is your new quantity demanded as well as your quantity supplied, and now Q3 is traded in the market. But the point is that your shortage is eliminated. So basically, so initially there was a disequilibrium, right? There was a shortage, and now that shortage has been eliminated and the equilibrium has been restored. So there's no need for government intervening and fixing this up, because the market should automatically fix this up. The prices will automatically fix this up, and that is the beauty of price mechanism. That there's no need for the government intervening in free markets, and that is why we say that free markets are efficient. That is one of the reasons why we say free markets are efficient. So what I've written is that rationing is basically, so for example, in a shortage, prices will automatically rise, leaving only those who have the willingness and ability to pay. So for example, if prices are rising, and now things are getting expensive because the shortage has to be rationed out. So obviously quantity demanded will contract, and like we said, that quantity demanded has contracted from Q2 to Q3, right? Because we just saw in the diagram that quantity demanded is contracting. So now this is your new quantity demanded as well as your quantity supplied. But then again, at this quantity, this quantity being demanded, people are willing and able to pay this price, right? The price of P3. So and that corroborates what I've written, that prices will rise, leaving only those who have the willingness and ability to pay. So price basically rations the scarce resources when demand outstrips supply. Basically, when demand is more than supply, so there's a shortage, resulting shortage immediately in the market, and that shortage will be subsequently eliminated by prices rising out, and that is why, and that is how the prices perform the rationing function. Now there's a reason I'm explaining this MCQ in detail, because this is, a lot of students don't even understand these four concepts. You guys need to understand that for paper 2, the students usually learn them and they write it. They basically reproduce what they have learned, and they get marks as well, even if they don't understand. But you can't do this with MCQs, because if you don't understand the concept, you will not be able to attempt the MCQs, right? So that is why it's important to understand the concept instead of just learning these up. And the allocative function is that the prices will basically, it means that more resources will be allocated to those markets that are more thriving and profitable. So like for example, in this diagram on this market, we saw that demand is rising. So if demand is rising, the market is becoming more profitable. So we see that there is more resources being allocated to this, which means that more output was now produced since quantity supplied was rising. So more resources will be allocated to this market. because it's now profitable, and hence we say that efficient resource allocation takes place. Why? Because resources are allocated in the right direction where firms can make more profits, indicating that free markets are basically flawlessly operating without any need of government intervention. So that is how the prices also perform the function of allocative function. And yeah, so that's it. So the answer basically, yeah, and I think I missed this one. So I explained to you that if prices are rising, will reduce quantity supplied, will increase quantity, if we reduce quantity supply demanded while increasing quantity supplied, and that is how it eliminates or rations the shortage, and that is why the answer is that this will reduce the quantity being sold in the market. You can see for yourself. Initially, the quantity that was demanded in the market was Q2, but then there was a resulting shortage, and then that resulted into the quantity that is being sold in the market. It basically had to go down, and then it falls to Q3, and basically a lot of customers will not be able to buy it because the demand was Q2, but basically only Q3 is now available. So even if Q2 is a demand, but Q3 is only available, so this difference is representing those customers who won't be able to buy it, right? And that is what the answer option D is representing. Uh, some consumers will no longer be able to buy it. So that is why the answer option should be D. Okay, so 8 is D. Moving forward, question number 9. So I hope you understood this. I gave quite a detailed explanation, by the way. Question number 9 says, in 2016, the car drivers bought more fuel because the price of oil from which it was made had fallen. So obviously, oil is the raw material for fuel, so the cost of production should go down if the price of raw material is going down. Which diagram represents this change in the market for fuel? So obviously, oil is the raw material for fuel, so the cost of production goes down, and whenever the cost of production goes down, the supply goes up, and your supply should go to the right, which is only in option D. That is, it goes to the right from S1 to S2, and your price falls, your quantity rises. So D should be the correct answer. So 9 is your D for David. Question number 10 says that the diagram shows the demand and supply for bread. Bread is a substitute for pasta and rice. Now, guys, whenever you're attempting these MCQs now, so obviously it shows, so first of all, I would highlight demand and supply of bread, and then I would highlight bread is a substitute for pasta and rice, because these are important for me to solve the MCQ. What would cause the demand for bread to shift from D1 to D2? We know that bread is basically the demand for bread. The demand for bread is going up, right? We saw this. Like, that's what is shown in the diagram. So what should be the answer? Basically, a rise in the price of pasta. Yeah, so this makes sense actually. This should be the answer. Why? Because if the price of pasta and rice rose, the demand for bread will go up, because pasta and rice are substitutes. And if substitutes get expensive, then people will switch to bread, right? So the demand for bread would go up, and that's the reason why the demand for bread will rise, because your substitutes are getting expensive. So now more people will demand bread. So the demand curve for bread would shift to the right. So 10 is A. A decrease in real income of consumers, so obviously that's not possible, because it should decrease the demand. A recession should decrease the demand. A subsidy given to producers of pasta and rice should actually increase the supply of pasta and rice. So again, all these MCQs the remaining options are wrong. Question 11 says the table shows the quantity demanded and of three goods when the price of good X changes. So good X, good Y, and good Z. So what is the relationship between X, Y, and Z? So, okay. So basically what's happening is that the price, so again, like what I'll try to break this down. So if I was a student, I would, I would have written it like this. It would have made my life more easier, and I would be able to comprehend MCQs. So I would have written price of good X would fall. No, so the next time I will not read this line, because now, whatever relevant is from that line, I've written it down. That is the price of good X fall. That's it, right? And now basically three different types of goods are given. So obviously, if price of good X falls, the quantity demanded of good X should rise, right? So, and that is what we are seeing, that if price of good X is falling, the quantity demanded of good X is rising. But we see that the quantity demanded for good Y is falling. So we see that the quantity demanded for good Y is going down. Good Y is going down, while the quantity demanded of good Z is going up. So if price of X goes down, the quantity demanded of X goes up, and the quantity demanded of Z also goes up. So obviously X and Z should be complements, no? Because if they are complements, they are bought, they are jointly demanded. So if X is demanded, then Z is also demanded. So if X demand is rising, Z's demand is also rising. So Z should be a complement for X, right? So the answer option, so you eliminate B and D. So remember, make your life easier. You eliminate two wrong options. Two will always be wrong. However, one will be similar to the right answer. It will make more, but one answer will obviously make more sense. So it could either be C or A. So if Z is the complement of X and you have reached that conclusion, then obviously Y should be a substitute, right? So you don't need to prove it in the exam because you don't have time and it's not even required. So if if Z is the complement, then Y should be the substitute. So the answer to 11 should be C, and that's it, right? And obviously we know that if the price of substitute, if the price of good X goes down, then obviously demand for good Y will go down because people will switch to substitutes, right? That is good X. Anyways, moving forward, question number 12 says a diagram shows three supply curves, and we see that all are starting from the origin. And I've explained you, I think there was a question somewhere in the first 8 to 9 questions that it's starting from the origin. So what can be concluded about the price elasticity or supply of the curves? Now guys, I'll tell you one thing. You need to understand that whenever your supply curve starts from the origin, the price elasticity of supply is equal to 1. That is unitary. Not only it is unitary, but at each point of the supply curve, the PES does not changes, it is constant. Because even if you're extending the length of the supply curve, the PES would always be constant throughout the length of this supply curve, which means that there are other supply curves whose length will not be constant, and I will explain it to you later as well, somewhere in the coming papers where such MCQs are given. Because the supply curve could start from the vertical axis as well as from the horizontal axis, and if that's the case, then throughout the length of the supply curve, the elasticity would keep on changing, and I'll explain you those MCQs when we reach to that point. But remember that whenever the supply curve starts from the origin, the PES is constant throughout the length of the supply curve and it is equal to 1. Now there are three supply curves given, that is basically S1, S2 and S3. So S1 is more steep as compared to S2, and S2 is more steep as compared to S3, and S1 is obviously more steeper as compared to S3 as well. So basically they have different slopes. S1, S2 and S3 have different slopes, but they all start from the origin and they are moving upwards from the origin, and which means that all three supply curves should have an elasticity that is equal to unity, that is equal to 1. Irrespective, we don't care about their slope. We don't care whether S1 is more steeper or S2 is more shallow or S3 is further shallow. We don't care about that. All three will have a unity elasticity, and the elasticity would be constant throughout the length of the curve. So the answer should be, so the answer should be D. The price elasticity of supply of each curve is basically constant, right? So that's the answer. Remember guys, now the supply curve, because I'll just take this to explain it to you as well, that for instance, let's say that if the supply curve starts from the vertical axis, let's say like this, it touches the vertical axis, that is the y-axis. So the price elasticity of supply would be basically greater than 1, that is elastic. But as you go up the curve, right, as you go up the length of the supply curve, the elasticity, the PES, would basically be falling, right? So that is why I was telling you that apart from a curve that starts from the origin, the other supply curves have elasticity that changes throughout the length of the supply curve, and we'll come to that when we reach that MCQ. I'll explain to you in further detail. But these laws you need to understand, and you need to remember these laws, because oftentimes these questions are repeated in the exam and students really don't understand, they don't really know about these laws, right? Yeah, so that's it. Moving forward, question number 13 is saying the diagram shows the market for smartphones in India. Rising incomes in India have seen a demand for this normal good from. So, obviously, if incomes are rising, demand will shift to the right. Which area now represents consumer surplus and which area represents producer surplus? So, it's a very good question. So basically, if you see which area now represents, so they're asking you the consumer surplus after the increase in demand. So let's check out the old consumer surplus, and the old producer surplus. So the old consumer surplus would be where your demand intersects your supply, right? Demand intersects your supply, and that is your old consumer surplus should be this triangle, that is the that is the area that is above the price and below the demand. That is, the old consumer surplus would be G, J, and N. That is this entire triangle, right? And the old producer surplus should be the area that is below the price and above the supply, which is K. Sorry, it's J, N, and K, right? This is your old consumer surplus and your old producer surplus, right? And now what should be your new producer and consumer surplus? Because the demand has increased, so the new producer and consumer surplus should be, if this is your supply and this is your demand, right? I'm highlighting them so that you can be very clear on this, and it's important if you highlight or shade them because it gives you a more clear picture. So for example, I would do that if I was in the exam. So for example, if now this is your new price, right? This is M is your new equilibrium basically. So the area of the new consumer surplus would be the area under the new demand curve and above the new price. What is the new price? H. What is the new demand curve? D2. So above H and under D2 would be this entire area, right? And that should be how much? So this entire area, which is how much, which is the new consumer surplus, should be F, H, and M, right? Understood? Makes sense? And what should be the new producer surplus, by the way? The new producer surplus should be the area that is below the new price and above the supply, above the old supply, because the supply curve has not changed actually. So if you look at this area, right, if you look at this area, this is your new producer surplus. That is the area above the supply and under the new price, that is under H. So this entire area is your new producer surplus, and that is equal to how much? That is equal to H, M, and K. Now let's see if any answer option is available. So producer surplus is HMK. Yeah, that's it. Consumer surplus is FMH. So yeah, I was right. Question number 13. The answer to question number 13 is A. FMH and HMK. Now guys, remember what consumer surplus is. Consumer surplus is basically representing the price, basically the welfare gain to consumers because they are willing to pay a higher price while the market price is less. So it's the welfare gain or the extra utility that they are gaining because they were willing to pay a much higher price, but they ended up paying a lower price in that. So the difference is representing the extra utility in terms of a lower price paid by them, and the extra utility that they have gained, that welfare utility, that welfare gain that they have made, those economic gains that they have made in terms of welfare for paying something that was worth more to them, but they paid less for it. Now I have some consumer surplus videos on my YouTube channel as well, so you want to get a clear idea about consumer surplus, you can watch that video, and it's also and producer surplus as well. I have videos on consumer and producer surplus where I've explained this concept. And what is producer surplus? Producer surplus is basically the welfare gain to producers because they are receiving a much higher price in the market than what is costing them to produce, right? So as in the minimum price that they would be willing to accept for producing that unit, they are basically getting a much higher price than the minimum price that they would want at least to produce that good, right? Basically the price is above their marginal cost, simply in simple terms. Question number 14 says a nationalized industry is privatized. Now, national industries are those industries that are under state control, and they basically allocate resources and own and control them. Privatized industries or firms are those that are under private sector's control, individuals' control, with the aim is profit maximization. Assuming there is no change in output of the industry. So, in the short run, there's no change in output in the industry, which means if your industry is basically sold to the private sector from the hands of the government. So in the short run, what the state is producing, the private sector is producing as well. What are the direct effects of the changes? So size of the public sector would obviously fall because now the nationalized industry was part of the public sector, but now this industry is privatized and it is now in the hands of the private sector, right? It's no more in the hands of the private. So size of the public sector should go down. The proportion of industry output entering the market, there would be no change because obviously there's no change in output in the industry in the short run. So the private sector in the shop, which basically means the private sector is not producing some extra units as we thought it would produce because that's what the question is assuming, that in the short run there's no change in output. Question 15 says, what is a distinguishing feature of Progressive income tax. Now, progressive income taxes are basically direct taxes which takes a higher proportion or a percentage of tax from people with higher incomes. So, people who have higher incomes, the progressive tax like income and corporate taxes would take a higher proportion or higher percentage of tax from people's incomes that have higher incomes, and a lower proportion of tax from people who have lower incomes. So basically, those who are on low incomes, for them the tax burden will be less, which means that low income work, that people, low income groups or the people who are paid less, they will have a low incidence or a burden of tax. And that is what progressive tax is all about. The proportion of the percentage of tax in terms of tax burden is higher with higher income groups and lower with lower income groups. So it creates a more equitable distribution of income. So the tax burden falls more on rich than the poor. And direct taxes are basically progressive in nature, like income tax, corporate taxes. And that is why we say that progressive taxes basically they reduce the inequality of incomes, and they create a more even distribution of income. This is also very important. It's often tested in MCQs, as opposed to regressive taxes, which create more inequality of incomes and uneven distribution of income. So the answer to 15 should be A, that high earners pay a higher proportion of their income, that is a higher percentage of their income in tax than low earners, right? Okay, guys, question 16 says, why might a government nationalize a private firm? Now, what's nationalization? Nationalization is where you sell the private sector firm or the private sector industry to the state that is in the hands of the government. And obviously, we do that because obviously the state is assumed to provide a greater social efficiency and more desirable outcomes for society. And we know that in a free market, the private sector allocates resources for towards the production of merit goods that is below the socially optimum level. So the private sector, so basically the merit goods are underprovided by the private sector in a free market, and that is one of the market failures, right? So if we are nationalizing the industry, so obviously it's assumed obviously that the state will provide merit goods up to the socially optimum level. So the answer should be 16B. Why might a government nationalize a private firm? To increase the provision of the merit goods, right? Okay. Moving forward to question number 17. The question says, it's a good question. The diagram shows the firm's supply and the demand for apples. Okay, so the demand supply diagram. If a minimum price is increased from P1 to P2, what will happen to the amount of the apples sold? Now, guys, okay, so the demand supply is given. So P1, this is the minimum price, this is the minimum price 1, and P2 is the minimum price 2. So there was already a minimum price, and now they have actually increased the minimum price from M1 to M2, right? Now, the question is asking you what will happen to the amount of apples that are sold. By sold means that, I mean, the quantity that is actually traded, right? So now, guys, basically, you need to understand what minimum prices are. Minimum prices are basically a form of price controls. Obviously, the government intervenes in the free market in a mixed economic system in order to control the prices, and they're basically the minimum prices are also called price floors. Minimum prices are also called price floors, and basically they are used to give the firms or the producers a higher incomes or higher revenues, right? So for example, the minimum price on food could be used to increase the income for farmers, just like in this question. It's saying that the government is increasing the minimum price. So the objective is that the government is guaranteeing a price of P2. Basically, the government is guaranteeing a price of P2 for the farmers of apples. So if they're increasing the price, they're actually giving the farmers a guarantee that, what, at this price, this is the minimum that you will receive. So don't worry, hang on, don't worry, okay? You won't receive anything less than P2. P2 is the minimum that you will receive, right? You can't receive, maybe you want to sell for more than P2, go ahead, sell it for more than P2, but P2 is legally the minimum price or the minimum that you are going to receive. So don't worry about that, right? This is what this is a guarantee that the government is giving to the farmers, right? Because we know that the market price is quite less, because this is the market price, which is, let's say, PO, which is quite less, right? And that is why minimum prices are usually imposed on agricultural goods, because of the uncertain outcome for farmers, and that is why the government guarantees them a price by imposing a price floor. Also, guys, remember that whenever a minimum price is imposed, below the equilibrium, it will always be ineffective. So a minimum price should always be imposed above the equilibrium. It should be above the equilibrium price, not below the equilibrium price. So if it is imposed below the equilibrium price, it would be ineffective and the market would continue to operate as it was operating, right? Or the free market outcome will basically prevail, not the minimum price outcome. The free market outcome will prevail, and as a result of that, the minimum price below the equilibrium will always be ineffective. Also, guys, remember, as far as minimum prices are concerned, it also comes in the MCQs. Minimum prices distorts the free market outcome. They're basically distorting. Even in this MCQ, we can see that it's distorting. It was already distorting, but since we increased it, so it's distorting it further. It's distorting the free market outcome, and it's resulting into a surplus. That is a disequilibrium, and that's a sign of inefficiency. Too much of the goods are produced than they should be produced, right? And that is why the price is because the price is not the free market price anymore, right? It's a price that has been imposed by the government, that will obviously distort the entire mechanism of resource allocation, and that is why too much resources are being allocated to the production of this good than it should be, and that is causing an inefficiency or inefficient resource allocation in the economy, in the society, right? Okay, so the answer to this should be that if the minimum prices increase from P1 to P2, what will happen to the amount of apples sold? So obviously, initially, if you could see that the quantity, basically the quantity supplied at P1 was Q3. Q3 was being supplied while Q1 was being demanded, right? So if Q3 is supplied while Q1 is demanded, so the amount of apples sold will obviously be OQ1, right? So initially, before the minimum price, how much was basically how much apples were sold? Basically, OQ1 were sold. Although OQ3 were produced, but who cares about how much is produced, right? We will obviously, only those will be sold that are being demanded. So even if Q3 is produced, but demand is less than supply, right? So obviously the sale will be based on the demand, not the supply, even if the supply is more. However, what happens is that when a minimum price is imposed, right? When a minimum price is imposed, the quantity demanded falls to OQ2, right? While the quantity supplied rises to OQ4. And we could see that this entire distance is representing a surplus, right? It's representing a surplus. It's just representing inefficiency. That because there's an excess supply in the market now, right? So there's an allocative inefficiency in the market. So basically, how much will be sold now? Only Q2 will be sold. So from OQ3, OQ2 will be sold. So the answer should be, it will decrease from Q1 to Q2. So the answer option should be A for apple. It will decrease from Q1 to Q2. Okay, guys. Moving forward, question number 18 says, in an attempt to reduce the crime, a government introduces a subsidy on the production of a burglar alarm, but sales rise very little. Okay. So if they're giving a subsidy, by the way, what are subsidies? Subsidies are basically financial grants that are given by the government to the private sector firms in order to reduce their cost of production so that they are able to increase their output and obviously reduce the price for the customers, for the people as well. So a subsidy is kind of a relief that is being granted not only to the producers but also to the consumers as well, because when the cost relief will be granted to the producers, they will transfer it in the form of a price relief in the form of a lower price to the consumer. So it's a relief for both the producers as well as the consumers. But how much that cost benefit will be transferred to the consumers obviously depend upon the price elasticity of demand. Anyways, so the question is saying which possible characteristics of the good would lead to this outcome. So why is that despite the subsidy, sales are rising very little? So let's basically draw a demand and the supply diagram, and we could see that let's say that so by the way, the answer to this question should be D. And if the PD is low, which means that the demand is inelastic, and let's say that the supply is low as well, which means the PES is low as well, which means that the supply is inelastic as well. So we could see that from even if your supply rises from S1 to S2, the quantity that is being traded in the market, we could see that the quantity that is being traded in the market rises very less from Q1 to Q2, right? Although guys, remember that the difference between the two supply curves, this vertical distance between the two supply curves is representing the amount of subsidy. So we could see that although the value of the subsidy, that is, let's say P3 minus P1, although this vertical distance is representing the value of the subsidy, which is equal to P3 minus P1, but still we could see that even though a large subsidy per unit is given, but still the quantity that is being sold in the market only rises from Q1 to Q2, right? And that is because the price elasticity of supply was low, as well as price elasticity of demand was low as well, right? So yeah, the answer to question number 18 is D for David. Low elasticity, by the way, means that it is inelastic, it is less responsive. High elasticity on the other hand means it's more elastic and it is more responsive. Question number 19. So question number 19, guys, says that, just a second. Yeah. Question number 19 says that compared with Pakistan, Germany has a higher output of pharmaceuticals per unit of resources that are used. What could explain this? The existence of floating exchange rate, okay, the law of absolute advantage, the Marshall terms. Yeah, so the answer should be B, the law of absolute advantage, because clearly when you are saying that compared with Pakistan, Germany has a higher output per unit of resource, right? So that is clearly indicating an absolute advantage, because you need to understand that higher output per unit of resource. Higher output, right? More units being produced, higher output per unit of resource, which means that, let's say if we use one factor of production is giving, let's say, 10 units in Pakistan. So the same one factor of production, assuming that it's the same quantity, is giving basically maybe 15 units in Germany, right? So obviously it's clearly, we can see it's an absolute advantage. So higher output per unit of resource basically means that the same 1 unit of resource in Germany, it basically produces more output than in Pakistan, right? And basically this is indicating, guys, higher productivity. This is indicating higher productivity, and it is also indicating higher efficiency. So guys, remember that absolute advantage is linked with higher productivity and higher efficiency. So the efficiency and productivity of the resource in Germany is higher than that of Pakistan. And the law of absolute advantage states that the economy can produce a greater quantity of goods, right? A greater quantity of goods for the same unit, for the same quantity of inputs, which obviously means that fewer resources are sort of needed to produce the same amount of goods. Because if you have an absolute, so let's say if Germany has an absolute advantage, so Germany can produce a greater quantity of goods for the same quantity of inputs as of Pakistan, right? So in other words, I could also say that for Germany, in order to produce a certain output, it needs fewer resources as compared to Pakistan to produce the same amount of goods. And that is why the average cost of producing this good, of average cost of producing pharmaceuticals in Germany will be less. And that is why the law of absolute advantage says that you can produce it at a lower average cost, right? So yeah, so these are all connected. So you should know that, because this MCQ can come in any form. Okay, question 19 should be B for boy. Moving forward, question number 20. Which statement about inflation, okay, I love this topic. Inflation is a rise in general price level, is correct. So inflation will lead to a rise in exports. No, it should lead to a fall in exports, because exports will become uncompetitive. Inflation will lead to a rise in real incomes. No, real incomes will go down. What are real incomes? Real incomes are disposable incomes adjusted for inflation. They're talking about the purchasing power, the buying power of those incomes. Inflation will lead to a rise in cost of living. Yes, option C is correct. It does leads to a rise in cost of living, and it leads to a fall in the purchasing power of money, which makes option D incorrect. So guys, question 21 says, why is that a country's balance of payments must always balance? Now this is a very interesting question, and I want to take this opportunity to explain this as well in a bit more detail so that you understand this concept. So first of all, what is BOP? You guys must know what BOP is, but I'll just revisit the definition. So BOP is basically a record, right? It's recording what? It's recording or measuring the inflows and the outflows of money into and out of the country, and by taking into account or measuring all the international transactions, right? So that is what BOP basically records and measures. Now, we have three accounts in a BOP, that is a current account, capital, and financial account. So when we're talking, and remember guys, there is a reason why the BOP is called a balance of payment. So basically when we're talking about the balance of payment, we are basically saying that the payments that are being made, right, these payments that are being made, they must balance. Again, I'm going to explain it to you. Yeah, you need to understand this name balance of payment means something. It means that the payments, right, they must balance. Now, what do you mean by payments they must balance? Whatever payments that we are making, that is whatever the outflows are, they must balance. And how will they balance? Obviously, they will balance only if these outflows are offset by inflows, right? So, guys, remember that a country's BOP must balance, because we need to understand that the current account balance, whether it's in a deficit or a surplus, this must be offset by the combined balance of the capital account and the financial account. So let's assume that if the current account is in a deficit, right? If the current account is in a deficit, then it must be offset or financed by the surplus on the capital and financial account. Now, guys, also remember the fact that in a capital account is basically a very small portion of your BOP, because it has very less transactions. So your main accounts are your current account and your financial account. So when we are saying that they must be offset by the current account deficit must be offset by a surplus on the capital and financial account, but we're basically majorly and primarily we are relying on the financial account surplus in order to finance the current account deficit, right? Because the capital account, it's a very small account. It has very small number of transactions, so it's not a major component of your balance of payment. The major components are your current account and financial account, and that has the largest number of transactions. So what I'm saying is that the current account deficit must be financed by the surplus on the capital and financial account, primarily the financial account. So let's assume that Pakistan is running a current account deficit. So Pakistan is basically running a current account deficit, right? There's a deficit on the current account. We know that the problem is these deficits are unsustainable. You can't sustain these deficits for a long period of time, because it will result into a lot of economic crisis, which we are witnessing right now. Pakistan is witnessing a lot of economic crisis because of the unsustainability of your current account deficits. And so basically now the thing is that these deficits should be financed by a financial account surplus. And how will that happen? It will happen because obviously, why will it be financed by a financial account surplus? Because all the other countries that are basically running on a current account surplus, those other countries that are basically have a current account surplus, so they have a lot of reserves. They have reserves of excess cash, right? And they will obviously use that reserves of cash to invest in Pakistan, assuming that Pakistan is offering higher returns, and investing in Pakistan is safe and secure, and Pakistan is attracting and giving good returns to foreign investors. So other countries will actually invest, or investors from the other countries will invest in Pakistan by buying, let's say, maybe government bonds of Pakistan, or maybe investing by buying shares in Pakistani companies, or maybe there could be hot money inflows into Pakistan, assuming that the rate of interest is higher in Pakistan, or there could be foreign direct investment in Pakistan. Maybe people, investors from other countries, or firms from other countries, they set up factories in Pakistan, right? Production activities take place. So the FDI would also result into inflows, which will obviously make the financial account into a surplus, offsetting the deficits on the current account, right? So this will basically cause a surplus on the financial account in Pakistan, and hence the BOP will balance. So basically what will happen is that the deficit of the current account will be financed by a surplus on the financial account. So then the BOP will balance, because if this is negative, it will be offset by a surplus, and ultimately the BOP balance must be, when we say that the BOP balance must balance, it means that the overall net balance of the BOP should be zero. Remember that. Right? And economic theory says that in theory, this will happen, because obviously, so why could Pakistan have a huge current account deficit? Obviously because of imports, right? So imports are the main component, or the main reason why we run deficits on the current accounts. So but the point is that if we need to understand that if we are importing from other countries, if Pakistan is importing from other countries, so although we are running into deficits, but they are running into surpluses, right? They are running into surpluses. So if they are running into surpluses and we are providing them income and revenues, they will use that excess reserves of income, cash, and they will use that reserves to actually then invest in other countries, right? They will not sit idle with lots of cash in their hand. They will use that foreign exchange which we have provided them in terms of by buying their exports. They will use that money to maybe sort of invest in our country, and that would theoretically result into a financial account surplus, and in theory the BOP will balance. But obviously this is not always the case. Remember that some of the transactions will not be recorded, there will be errors and omissions, and because of that we the difference by which the balance of payment is not balancing will be a figure which is known as net errors and omissions. But I'm not going into those details. But yeah, in practical, in theory, the BOP will balance. But guys, remember that if the BOP is not balancing, not because of errors and omissions, the fact that the financial account is not running into a surplus, because we're assuming that we will get those inflows and it will offset the current account deficit. What if we are not able to attract those inflows? So if the government is not able to attract although the government should attract the inflows, maybe it should make the investments more secure or more attractive by attracting foreign investors, or maybe increase the interest rate so that there is more hot money inflows, or maybe sort of attract FDI into the country by improving the infrastructure and all of that. But even if it is not able to do so, if it is not able to run enough financial account surpluses to offset the current account deficits, in that case, guys, the government will ultimately still have to finance the current account deficit. Now, how will it do that? If it's not attracting the required necessary inflows, then it will ultimately resort to its foreign currency reserves. It will use those foreign currency reserves and it will fund or finance that current account deficits by utilizing its foreign currency reserves. But obviously that's the last option that we have. And even if we run out on those reserves, then ultimately we will still have to finance the deficit, because somehow the BOP have to make sure that the BOP balance is zero. So in that case, the last option will be that we have to go to the IMF and World Bank. And this is actually the exact crisis that Pakistan is going through right now. This is the exact crisis that Pakistan is going through right now. And basically what happens is that ultimately if a country is not able to attract, ultimately the country's reserves run out, and we are very short of foreign currency reserves, if all our foreign currency reserves deplete and we don't have any more reserves to finance our current account deficit, we need to understand that our reserves are not there for financing our deficits. We have a lot of other things to do from reserves as well. We need to pay our loans, we need to pay our liabilities. Reserves are also used to manipulate and alter the exchange rates. So obviously there are a lot of lots and lots of functions of reserves. The reserve money is also used to finance investments in the country. So we aren't supposed to actually technically finance deficits from those reserves, right? But if there's no other option, then we have to. And even if the reserves are ending, because that's not sustainable, then ultimately, a country has to go for a bailout, which means that ultimately it has to go to the IMF or the World Bank to lend money. So ultimately, the many, I explained all this process so that you guys can actually understand and the whole process of how the balance of payment works. So the answer to 21 should be C, that the current account is balanced by the capital and the financial account. Okay, guys, so question number 22 says, which argument for protection would be most relevant if the government of country X decided to exercise voluntary export restraint, that is VER, in its trade with country Y? Okay, so basically what's happening is there are two countries, that is country X and country Y, and country X has decided that it is going to exercise the voluntary export restraint, right, in its exports with country Y. So country X is basically the exporting country and country Y is the importing country, right? Now, why I've written exporting and importing country, I'll let you know, but first let's see what a voluntary export restraint is. So guys, voluntary export restraint, remember, is firstly it's a non-tariff barrier, right? So it's where a country is getting into an agreement, right? It's getting into an agreement with the other country to limit basically the volume of its exports to other countries. So for example, country X is getting into an agreement with country Y, right? and this happens on the request of the importing country. So, for example, country X is exercising the voluntary export restraint, right? Since it's the exporting country, so it is exercising that or implementing that on the request of country Y. So basically, what's happening is that country X is exporting to country Y, and country Y is importing from country X. So the problem is that country Y also has some domestic industries. Now, if country Y is importing goods from country X, that the domestic industries are under threat, right, for country Y. So country Y has requested country X, to limit the number of exports or the volume of exports it is making to country Y, so that its domestic industries of country Y are protected. This is what an export restraint is, right? So remember that the export restraint is made, the request for the export restraint is made by the importing country, and then it is exercised or implemented by the exporting country, basically. So yeah, that's what a voluntary export restraint is. So they are getting into an agreement basically to limit the volume of its exports to the other country. So country X will be limiting the volume of its exports to country Y now. And remember that like I said, the VER is basically the result of a request that is made by the importing country, because that is important for this MCQ, because so that this will help you understand the answer, that why are we selecting the answer for this MCQ. So basically, it's made as a result of a request that is made by the importing country, so that it's basically providing a measure of protection for its domestic businesses of country Y, basically, because the country's Y's domestic businesses or industries or firms are competing. They're also producing competing goods of what is being imported from country X, right? So remember that. And the one question that you could ask me is that why is country Y requesting for an export restraint with country X, or why is country X implementing that export restraint? Why would is a country stupid that it wants to limit its own exports? I mean, what's going wrong here? Is country X nuts? No. The simple answer is that if country X will not accept the request of country Y to limit those exports, the problem is that ultimately country Y will then limit its own imports. Ultimately, the country Y will resort to tariff barriers. It will impose sanctions, quotas, or tariffs and embargoes, and that will be more threatening, or it will be more worse for country X in that sense. So actually, accepting the request and exercising a voluntary export restraint by country X is in favor of country Y as well, and in favor of country X as well. Because then, we know that how retaliation and then imposition of tariffs and then retaliation, and then it just makes things worse off for both countries. So that is why what we are saying is that basically two things important here. First of all, the VER will be imposed by the exporting country at the request of the importing country, and they will do this because it will basically the VER will allow the exporting country to avoid later tariffs or quotas that can be imposed by the importing country, like country Y in this case. And the thing is that since the VER export restraint is implemented by the exporting country, that is country X itself, so it will enable country X or the exporting country to have a degree of control, basically, because the exporting country or country X is setting its own restrictions, right? Who is excising those restrictions? Who is excising the restrictions or limiting exports? Country X itself. So now they are more in control, right? So country X is setting the restrictions on its own imports. So that is why we are saying that it would give country X more control. So yeah, that's what export restraint is. So according to this MCQ question 22, it says which argument for protection would be most relevant if the government of country X decided to exercise voluntary export restraint in its trade with country Y. So the answer would be option C, because voluntary export restraint would help to negotiate the improved trading condition between X and Y. Because otherwise, if this weren't imposed, maybe country Y would have imported or resorted to, tariffs and quotas, and then this would have been, subsequently be witnessed by retaliation from country X, and then maybe a further retaliation from country Y then later subsequently. So otherwise it would be not in favor for both countries to engage into this sort of a trade war, right? uh, that is based on retaliation from both parties. So that is why the answer option C is the best answer in this case, because it makes complete sense, because exercising a VER on the request of an important country is in interest of both the countries actually. So it would help to negotiate improved trading conditions. Obviously it would help negotiate improved trading conditions between both countries, because obviously country Y has requested to reduce its own exports of country X, and country X is accepting that request instead of waiting for country Y to impose trade barriers. Country X has, it's kind of a favorable situation and a sign of good mutual understanding between both the countries, right? So yeah, that's it. So that is why C is the correct answer. Um, it also it basically also kind of shows that country X is kind of considerate about how the domestic firms might be suffering from its exports to country Y. So yeah, so that is why we say that it might improve. It's kind of negotiating improved trading conditions between both the countries. So it's a good sign of goodwill as well. Question number 23 says, the average price of a country's exports increased by 5%, okay, and the average price of its imports increased by 10%. What can we definitely conclude from this information? Now obviously the answer options are talking about the balance of trade. So let's first talk about what is balance of trade. So balance of trade is basically we know that it's the index of export prices, because we know that it's expressed as an index over the index of import prices. Index of import prices in times 100. We are basically multiplying it by 100 because we want to calculate the value as an index number. That is why we're multiplying it by 100. We're not multiplying it by 100 so that we can get a percentage, not a percentage, okay? It's an index number. So guys, since it says that your import prices are basically increasing by 10% while the export prices are going up by 5%, so in this case the terms of trade would actually deteriorate, or you could say the terms of trade would worsen, right? Because the simple reason is that the import prices are rising faster or greater than the export prices. So in this case, the terms of trade would worsen. Now, like I said, what is terms of trade? It's basically an index, right? It's an index. Remember that shows the value. It's an index that is telling us or showing the value of a country's basically average export prices relative to, because this line is telling us the relative export price over the import price, right? Basically the value of the terms of trade, remember that the value of the terms of trade is basically a measure. Basically it's a measure of how much, you could say, how much imports a country can buy, right? How much imports a country can buy for, you could say, for a unit of its exports. That is, against one unit of exports, how much imports can you buy, right? That is what the terms of trade index is telling us. So if the terms of trade index worsens, let's say if the terms of trade in 2012 was 100, which is for, let's say that 2012 is a base year, so the index for the base year is always 100, and in 2013 the terms of trade went down to, let's say, 96, right? It went down to 96. So it basically worsened, right, in a year. And if it worsens, you could conclude, because this conclusion is important because these kind of MCQs do come. So if the terms of trade basically worsens, it means that a basket of exports, and I'm writing all this down so that you can learn this, because what it comes in the exam, that the terms of trade worsens, and then what conclusion can you derive. So you need to understand what does it means if a terms of trade worsens, right? So a basket of exports, since the terms of trade have worsened from 100 to 96, it means that a basket of exports would be able to buy 4% less imports compared to basically what it could have bought in the base year. So technically what we mean here is that we need to, so now we need to, we need to sort of export more. We need to export more quantity now. We need to export more quantity now in order to buy the same imports. Because obviously what's happening is that the import prices are rising more than export prices, right? So the terms of trade will definitely go down, as in the terms of trade would deteriorate. Now if the terms of trade deteriorates, it simply means that since the terms of trade is basically telling us that how much imports a country can buy for a unit of for a unit of its exports. So if the terms of trade goes down, as in if the terms of trade deteriorates, it worsens. It means that one unit of exports can buy less imports now. So if we want to buy the same imports as we were as compared to the previous year or the base year, we need to sell more exports. That's what it simply means. So a basket of exports would be able to buy 4% less imports. This is what we can derive from this example. Or we need to export more quantity now in order to buy the same imports, right? So these two, this concept could be expressed in 2-3 different ways, although it means the same thing. But in your MCQ paper 1 questions, the examiner can ask you what conclusion can you derive, or it could also, at times it also comes like from in this form as well. Like for example, they could say which of the below statement is true, right? So they could either give you one statement like this. Maybe they could say that we need to now export more quantity in order to buy the same imports, right? And maybe this answer option would be correct because this would be the only true option. Okay, so yeah, otherwise for question 23 it says, since we know that terms of trade have worsened, so the answer option would be D. Its terms of trade have worsened. That's it. Simple. And remember that if export prices, if whenever your export prices would rise less than the rise in import prices, definitely terms of trade would worsen. And if export prices are rising more than the rise in import prices, your terms of trade would improve, right? Anyways, question 24 says there is an increase in indirect taxes. Okay, indirect taxes are taxes that are imposed on firms, they're imposed on the product, and the effect is that these taxes basically increase the cost of production of the product of the firms, and as a result it makes them expensive, and obviously when things will get expensive it will result into cost push inflation. So what will be the impact on demand pull and cost? Definitely if indirect taxes are imposed, cost push inflation will arise because obviously indirect taxes has the effect of increasing the cost of the firms. So basically the answer would either be, it could either be B or it could be D. So we cross out A and C. So, and what will happen to demand pull inflation? Demand pull inflation should fall. Why? Because the simple reason is that if indirect taxes are imposed, let's say if GST is increased, so obviously it will make things expensive and it will reduce consumer expenditure or consumer spending. If consumer spending goes down, which is a component of aggregate demand, C is a component of aggregate demand, AD would go down. If AD would go down, demand pull inflation will fall, hence it makes B the right answer. So guys, question number 25 says that the table shows the number of biscuits and cakes that can be produced by 4 workers in an hour. Okay, so you have 4 different people, and in an hour, they are telling you how many biscuits can be produced or how many cakes can be made, right? Who has the greatest comparative advantage in producing biscuits? Okay, fine. So what is comparative advantage? Comparative advantage states that basically the law of comparative advantage was given by David Ricardo, who said that a country's a country has a comparative advantage in producing a good when it can produce it at a lower opportunity cost, right? But here they haven't given 4 countries, they have given 4 different people, so the logic would be the same. So let's see that who has a comparative advantage in producing biscuits. So for that we need to calculate the opportunity cost of producing biscuits. So let's say so Laura can basically make 6 biscuits, or she can make 3 cakes, right, in an hour. So let's say that let's calculate the opportunity cost of producing 1 biscuit. So if she produces 6 biscuits, she has to forgo 3 cakes. So if she produces 1 biscuit, then how many cakes will she have to forgo? It would be 3 divided by 6. So it means that for every one biscuit, basically she has to forgo half a cake, right? So she has to forgo 0.5 cakes. On the other hand, Mr. M, in order to produce one biscuit, has to forgo one cake, that is 10 upon 10. Mr. N, for every one biscuit, Mr. N has to forgo how many cakes? He has to forgo, for every one biscuit, he has to forgo 0.92 cakes. And Mr. Umar has to forgo, for every one biscuit, he has to forgo two cakes, right? Now, if you can see from these calculations, that the lowest opportunity cost of producing biscuits is with Miss Laura, because she can produce a biscuit at the lowest opportunity cost. Because in order to produce a biscuit, she only has to forgo 0.5 cakes, while Mr. M has to forgo one cake. On the other hand, Mr. N has to forgo 0.92 cakes, and Mr. Umar has to forgo two cakes, right? So the lowest opportunity cost of producing a biscuits lies with Miss Laura, who only has to forgo half a cake in order to produce the same one biscuit, which will be produced by all the other people, but they would although make one biscuit just like she is making one, but they'll have to forgo more cakes than the amount of cakes Miss Laura is foregoing, right? So Miss Laura has a comparative advantage in producing uh, biscuits, because she can produce biscuits at the lowest opportunity cost than the rest of the three workers. So the answer should be A, who has the greatest comparative advantage. She has the greatest comparative advantage. Okay. Question number 26 states that which condition is necessary for a country's BOP on its current account to improve if it reduces exchange rate, right? So a country, if it reduces the exchange rate, a country is reducing exchange rate means it is devaluing the currency, right? So if you're devaluing the currency, what condition is necessary for the current account to actually improve? So guys, remember that whenever a country devalues its currency, what happens is that the price of exports go down, which makes your exports cheaper, and the quantity of exports go up, which means that export revenues would rise and the price of imports would go up, which makes imports expensive, so the quantity of imports should go down, so import expenditure should fall, and as a result of this, your export revenue should rise, import expenditure should fall, and your deficits would reduce, right? Now this is the logic, or this is what the economic theory suggests us. But for this to happen, like for this entire thing to happen, there's a condition that is necessary, which was given by Marshall Lerner, and they said that for the devaluation to work as it's supposed to work, they said that they were basically two different economists, and they said that for a currency devaluation to lead to an improvement on its current account, which means that for currency devaluation to reduce the deficit on the current account, the sum of price elasticity of demand and the plus the price elast sorry what I'm saying, the sum of price elasticity of demand for exports and the price elasticity of demand for imports should be greater than 1, right? So for example, let's take an example that let's say a country, Pakistan, has the PED for exports is, let's say, negative 0.6. Why negative? Because it's PED, the PED sign would always be negative. And the PD for imports, let's say, is negative 0.2. So forget the minus signs, and you add 0.6 and 0.2 up, so it will be 0.8. Now 0.8 is obviously less than 1, which means that the sum of elasticities is not greater than 1. In fact, it's less than 1. So in this condition, in this situation, the devaluation will not work. In fact, it would worsen the current account, right? So remember that if you want your devaluation to improve your current account, the sum of elasticity should be greater than 1. If they are less than 1, it will actually make your current account's position worse. And economic theory also suggests us that the PED for exports and imports, guys, is inelastic in the short run. So in the short run, the PED for exports and the PED for imports is inelastic in the short run, but it's more elastic in the long run. The PD for exports and the PD for imports is more elastic in the long run, right? Now there's entire different reasons for it, and I'm not going to be getting into those details, but yeah, so that's the case. So guys, remember that for a devaluation will basically, so if in the short run, that is why in the short run we say that a devaluation worsens the current account deficit before it actually improves in the long run. So a current account deficit actually worsens in the short run because economic theory tells us that the PD for exports and imports is inelastic and the Marshall-Lerner condition is not met in the short run. However, in the long run it is met, and that is why in the long run your current account position starts to improve. But before that it actually worsens, and this is actually shown by the J-curve effect, right? So the answer to this MCQ should be C, that the sum of price elasticities of domestic demand for imports and the foreign demand for exports must be greater. Now, obviously, the purpose of the examiner is to confuse you. So they have they have tried to just make it unnecessarily complicated by, instead they could have also just written the sum of price elasticity of demand for imports and exports is greater than 1, but they have unnecessarily purposely tried to make it more confusing by saying, oh, you know what, the price of demand for domestic demand for imports and foreign demand for exports, to actually make you think. They're just testing your concept anyways. Question number, so I hope this is clear. Question number 27 says, okay, this is a good question. It says the diagram shows the effect of United States imposing a tariff on the import of steel in 2018. So United States is basically importing steel, and the diagram is given. So basically, the domestic demand for steel, this is your domestic demand curve for steel, right? And then this is your supply curve, and this is your domestic demand curve, right? Anyways, this is representing your world price for steel. At the world price, the quantity that is being demanded is this much, that is OQ4, while the quantity being supplied in the domestic market by the domestic producers is OQ1. Now, guys, basically what this means is that the domestic consumers are importing at the world price, right? And at the world price, they are demanding Q4 units, because if they're offered QPW, they will demand Q4. And the domestic producers, if the domestic producers are offered PW by the domestic consumers, if they basically produce the units at PW, if they're offered PW, if they get PW, so they are only willing and able to make how many units? Q1 units. So obviously the difference would be then imported, because the consumers will satisfy the domestic demand by importing, right? Because part of the domestic demand is satisfied through domestic production, which is OQ1, and the remaining will be satisfied through imports. But obviously we need to reduce imports, and because of that we impose a tariff, which is a trade barrier form of protection, and that increases the world price to PW plus tariff, right? So it simply means that your world price increases by the amount of tariff. This difference is representing the tariff per unit, right? So anyways, so what happens now is that at the price plus tariff, basically the domestic demand at PW plus T, which is this price, the domestic demand at PW plus T, is it basically falls to Q3, right? Yeah, it falls to Q3. And at PW plus 3, the domestic supply rises to Q2. Now, why does the domestic supply rises to Q2? Because it means that if the domestic firms are offered PW plus T, right? If domestic consumers buy from domestic firms by offering the domestic firms PW plus T, since if they're importing at PW plus T, but what if they just offer domestic suppliers PW plus T? So how much will they be willing and able to supply at PW plus T? They will be only willing and able to supply Q2. But we can see that although they are willing and able to supply a bit more than as compared to Q1. Why? Because obviously they are offered a higher price. So at a higher price, the quantity supplied extends, right? So that is the same logic being applied. So the domestic production basically rises from Q1 to Q2. This is the representing the amount by which domestic production rises. So, but the domestic demand is Q3, and the domestic supply at the world price plus tariff is Q2. This is the domestic demand. This is the domestic supply, and obviously this difference will now be imported. So how much is imported? Basically Q3 minus Q2 is imported. But again, the point is that your domestic the point is that your imports basically they basically fall, right? So the answer should be C. Imports fall from Q1 Q4 to Q3 Q2 Q3. That is Q1 Q4 basically means this difference. This is Q1 Q4. They fall to Q3 Q2. Why? Because obviously part of the reason or part of the explanation, guys, for the fall in imports is that some of your domestic demand shrinks, because obviously at a higher price less would be demanded, and part of the reason for that is that at a higher price some of the demand is also satisfied by a rise in domestic supply. So yeah, that's about it. So this difference is basically now only imported, right? So it's a policy that is successful in reducing your size of the imports. So part C says that imports fall from Q1 Q4 to Q3 to Q2 Q3. At oftentimes in these MCQs at times they ask you how much is the government's revenue. Sometimes they ask you by how much did the domestic demand fell. So domestic demand fell from Q4 to Q3. Domestic production rises from Q1 to Q2. At times they ask you how much is the fall in consumer surplus. At times they ask you how much is the British surplus changing, how much is the government's tax revenues, what is the area of deadweight loss. So you guys must thoroughly practice these diagrams, okay? Question number 28 says, in 2012, the Indian government stated that it aimed to reduce its budget deficit to 5.1% of GDP. Which policy is most likely to help this aim in the short run? Now, what is a budget deficit? A budget deficit is when the government expenditure or spending is more than the tax revenue. Now, we know that the tax revenue is the main or the primary source of revenue for the government, right? Because that is a primary sustainable source of revenue from the government, through which the government is on a daily basis earning revenues. Now, obviously, in order to reduce this deficit, it needs to increase. So the only way it could reduce the deficit is through reducing government spending or increasing your tax revenues. Now, obviously, the government just wouldn't want to reduce the spending, because obviously it has implications. You can't just reduce your spending, and because that has certain implications, especially spending on essential public services. Now, the thing is that the government, so now they are asking, since the word is short run, so the immediate reduction in budget deficit could be achieved through a quick source or a quick stream of revenue that can be achieved, one of the reasons to achieve a quick source or quick stream of revenue could be achieved through the sale of those state-owned assets, right? The nationalized assets, they could sell those, and then get that money from the money that they get. That money could be used to fund or finance the deficits. Yeah. So question 28, the answer should be C, an increase in the sale of state-owned assets. State-owned assets means state-owned firms, state-owned property, wealth, everything that is state-owned. Anyways, question 29 says, what would make a policy of raising interest rates less likely to be effective in reducing inflation? Now, this is an interesting question. Obviously, we know that whenever interest rates go up, so if interest rates go up, the cost of borrowing rises, which reduces consumer expenditure. It also reduces investment spending, because cost of borrowing rises for individuals, consumers, as well as for firms. And that reduces aggregate demand, which reduces the demand pull inflation. Now, this is what the chain of analysis, but the thing is that they're asking us that what would make this policy ineffective. Right now, this policy seems effective, but what would make it ineffective? Aggregate supply rising faster? No. Consumers expect prices to rise even faster in the future. Now, this makes sense. B should be the answer. Why? I'll tell you. Now, if consumers would expect prices to rise even quicker in the future, although the monetary authorities, they have raised the interest rates, but still consumers are fearing, or they expect, because consumer expectations play a role, right? Now, consumers are expecting that the prices will, there's a say there's a spread of word in the market that, everyone is expecting the prices to rise even faster in the future, in the coming weeks or months. So obviously, out of fear, they would start spending more, because they would know that whatever they want to buy right now will get expensive in the coming weeks or months. So they should spend more right now, and then get those goods and services at a cheaper price, because they would get expensive in the future. That's what they think, and that's what they're expecting. So out of that expectation, they would start spending more right now. So the consumer spending, instead of falling, would actually rise. And instead of reducing inflation, it would further fuel inflation, which making the government contractionary monetary policy of increasing interest rates less effective. That is why B is the correct answer. Let's move on to question number 30. Question 30 says, a country X is an open economy, okay, which obviously is an economy without trade barriers that engages in international trade with a floating exchange rate. Okay, good. It changes to a fixed exchange rate. Okay, which combination of policy changes would be most effective in reducing inflation? So the first column is talking about the fiscal policy, and then it's talking about the new fixed exchange rate. Okay, this is an interesting question. Now, obviously, if you want to reduce inflation, as far as the fiscal policy is concerned, as far as indirect taxes is concerned, you will definitely not increase indirect taxes, because indirect taxes would fuel cost push inflation, since indirect taxes are taxes imposed on firms and products, and the effect is that they increase cost of production, so they will fuel cost push inflation. So definitely C and D is not the answer. The answer lies either with A or B. Now, so basically, but if you increase direct taxes, let's say you increase income tax or you increase corporate tax, they both are direct taxes. So if you increase income tax, consumer spending would go down because disposable income would fall. And if you increase corporate tax, investment would go down because profit after taxes would fall. So less profits for reinvestment. So obviously investment spending goes down. So AD would go down because of C and I being falling. AD would go down and inflation would go down as well. So answer should either be A or B. Now the second column says the new fixed exchange rate is either fixed above the purchasing power parity or below the purchasing power. Now guys, purchasing power parity is something that recently I have been getting a lot of questions on purchasing power parity. Regarding to make a video on this, and I will definitely be making a video on this. So I'll briefly explain what purchasing power parity is in this video, but definitely in more detail in the next video. Because this is something that has been confusing a lot of students, and I've been getting a lot of requests from my Instagram for this. Guys, purchasing power parity, when you say purchasing power parity, parity means making it, purchasing power parity means purchasing power is same. Parity means same, equal. So purchasing power parity means purchasing power being equal. So when you say purchasing power equal and when you say purchasing power parity exchange rate, it means that the exchange rate is such that makes the purchasing power equal. PPPER. The exchange rate is such that makes the purchasing power equal, right? If this makes sense to you guys. Anyways, so purchasing power parity exchange rate is an exchange rate, right? That basically reflects what? It reflects the same purchasing power in different countries. So let's take two countries. Let's take USA and UK. So let's say that the cost of, now basically this is a very interesting theory about the Big Mac index. But so let's say that the cost of a Big Mac, we know what Big Mac is, right? McDonald's Big Mac. Let's say the cost of Big Mac in UK is, let's say, £2, and the cost of Big Mac in USA is $4, right? Let's say the cost of Big Mac in UK is £2, while the cost of Big Mac in USA is $4. So if I am in UK, I will buy it for £2. If I am in USA, I will buy it for £4. Okay, that's okay, fine. Now, so let's suppose I'm in UK right now. You all watching this video right now are watching this video in UK. And if you call McDonald's in UK and you ask them how much is the Big Mac for, and they'll answer you, oh, you know what, it's for £2. While your friends, if they are watching this video in the USA right now, will call McDonald's in the US and ask them how much is it for, they'll say it's for $4, right? Now, why am I giving you this example? I'll tell you. Let's assume that £1, right now the exchange rate of pound for dollars is that £1 is exchanged, that is £1 is sold, and against that dollars are bought. So basically, if you sell £1, you get $2. Now, if I say that this exchange rate, which is actually the purchasing power parity exchange rate, it means that if I basically buy a Big Mac in UK for £2, and if I want to buy the same Big Mac when I go to USA, and if I have £2 in my wallet right now, and if I get those £2 exchanged just for the sake of buying a Big Mac in USA, how many dollars should I actually end up getting? I should be ending up getting $4, because it means that the buying power of £2 in UK, the same buying power of £2, so the £2 is exactly has the same buying power of buying the Big Mac in UK, as those £2 have the same buying power of buying a Big Mac in USA, because the same £2 could be exchanged for $4, and a Big Mac could be bought. But if, let's say, I would have said that the Big Mac in USA would have costed, let's say, $6, now this exchange rate wouldn't reflect the PPP exchange rate, because now the £2 that I have right now with me, if I get them exchanged in USA, I get $4, but the Big Mac is not for $4, right? The Big Mac is for bloody $6. So the purchasing power is not equal, right? The purchasing power of pound in this case wouldn't have been equal. But right now, since I'm assuming that the exchange rate of a pound for dollar is £1 is worth $2, it means that this is the PPP exchange rate, meaning that the power of a pound in terms of how much that £1 can buy in UK, that same good, exactly the same good in USA cost us how much? It cost us $2. And the same good exactly in UK cost us how much? It cost us £1. So the man is indifferent whether in UK or USA. He can actually, if I have a pound in my pocket in UK, I can buy something in UK, and the same thing I can buy in USA for $2, which means either I have £1 or I have $2. It means the same thing, because the buying power of pound in the buying power of pound in UK is exactly the same of that pound in USA, because obviously in USA pound will not work. That's not the currency of USA. But when I exchange the pound for dollar, in return of that £1, I get $2. And the same good which I used to buy in UK, the same good is now in USA, it's for $2 as well. So if I exchange the pound for dollar, I get $2 in return, and the same good in USA costs me $2. So I'm indifferent whether I buy it in USA or UK. So the pound has the same buying power in UK as it has in USA. And that is what the PPP exchange rate is. It reflects the same purchasing power in different countries, right? So it's quite an interesting thing. So basically, I'll just run through you again that it means that the £2 in UK have the same purchasing power in USA as well, because as it had in UK, because the Big Mac in UK costed £2, while £2 converted to dollars in USA gives you $4 in hand, right? And you can buy the same Big Mac in USA for $4, right? So this means that the exchange rate that we have right now in front of us, that is the exchange rate when your £1 is equal to $2, is the PPP exchange rate, purchasing power parity exchange rate, because this exchange rate makes the purchasing power of pound and the purchasing power of dollar equal at parity. Since this exchange rate reflects the same purchasing power of £1 that has in UK, than the same £1 has in USA, because the same £1 is worth $2 in USA, right? Which means that the £2 in UK have the same purchasing power in USA when the £2 is converted to $4 in USA, it will have the same purchasing power. So the customer is indifferent basically to buying the Big Mac in UK and buying it in the USA. That's what the purchasing power parity theory is. So I would honestly want to explain it in more detail by giving some more examples, because this is an interesting topic, but students are a lot of confused. But I think the video has been too long, and I want to right now just end it. So I will just now jump straight to the MCQ. I hope you understood what PP is. If you haven't, please mention in the comments. Get in touch with me on Instagram. But anyways, moving forward, so as far as this question is concerned, let's assume that £1 equals to $2. This is my PPP exchange rate. Now, we are talking from the UK economy's perspective. Let's say that country X is UK. So £1 is $2, which is the PPP exchange rate. Now, the UK government, which is country X, the UK government sets an exchange rate it fixes an exchange rate which is above the PPP exchange rate. Which means that it fixes the exchange rate. It says that now £1. This was the PPP exchange rate, by the way. It says that the exchange rate is basically $3.5, which is the fixed exchange rate. That is what it sets. You could say that the exchange rate is kind of overvalued against the PPP exchange rate, right? So if you look at the UK's perspective, and if this is the exchange rate that the UK government or the country X fixes, and if you compare it with the PPP exchange rate, so you could say that for the UK, the price of exports would rise because what would happen is that because it's kind of overvaluing the pound here, because if you compare it with the BBP exchange rate, and now basically it cost the USA citizens $3.5 to buy £1 of goods actually, which is making the exports expensive. So the quantity of UK exports would go down, which would mean that export revenues would go down, right? On the other hand, the price of imports would fall because for UK they can actually end up getting $3.5, 3.5 bloody dollars. So the price of imports is going down and they can actually import more now, so the quantity of imports would go up, so import expenditures would go up. So technically what's happening is that your net exports are falling because your export revenues are going down and your import expenditures are going up, so your net exports are falling. Net exports are a component of aggregate demand, so aggregate demand goes down. When aggregate demand goes down, demand pull inflation goes down. That is the simple logic. Hence, this makes the answer A. Higher direct taxes, so we already identified. If the government fixes the new exchange rate above the purchasing power parity, like in this case, so it would be the most effective in reducing inflation because demand pull inflation will go down. So yeah, that's about it. It was a good paper, interesting paper. I personally enjoyed it. Do mention in the comments. If you're liking my videos, enjoying them, do mention in the comments. I would respond to those comments as well. That's it for this video, guys. I'll see you all around in another video with another past paper. See you there in the next video. Until then, take care.